Menstrual myths. I laugh because there's so many of them. So I know for some people watching this is probably really uncomfortable and like TMI, but it's essential that we start talking about it because all too often the male coaches that I have worked with, which there's actually quite a few of them now, they're like ostriches and they just put their head in the fucking sand and they kick everything up. And instead of actually asking women about their menstrual cycle, they just pretend like it doesn't exist. As a researcher, I work with doctors, but I am not a doctor. I am simply a researcher, so this is purely educational purposes only. My name is Victoria Felkar, and I'm a researcher at the University of British Columbia. So, when it comes to the strength community, physical culture world, we're so fucking dumb when it comes to women's health issues. There is like, even in the last, I would say like 3 months, I'm seeing more and more myths getting dispelled through social media. Like infographics have probably been both the worst and the best thing that have happened to women's health issues, because in one hand, they get people talking, which I love that. But then on the other hand, it's like they're talking about bullshit. So without further ado, I'm just going to try to address some menstrual myths. One of the biggest ones that I see in our industry is the kind of the fallacy around just like whether or not you have your period or not. So there's this idea that when you don't have your period, it's normal because you're an athlete or you're competing. And when you do have your period, it means that you're healthy. Not true. It's the individual. So amenorrhea is when you are typically speaking associated with a lack of menses. If you don't have menses, if you don't have the bleed, it doesn't mean that it's good or bad. Some people just don't have a regular menstrual cycle. And what I mean by that is that within kind of the medical community, up until about the early 90s, really still today, there's this perception that we have to have like this perfect 28-day period. It's gotta be 28 days every single month. If it's not that, you're not healthy, which is a myth. There's been a lot of different like studies that have been done on this. Dr. Geraldine Pryor, I'm very, very fortunate that I've been able to talk to her about this. She was the one in the early 90s that really kind of came out there and said like, look, like women don't have this perfect cycle. And she did this massive survey of women and was able to see like, look, they range from like in the teens to in the 40s in terms of days. And that some women, it's more than that. Some women, it's a cycle every 3 months. And if that's them, hey, that's them. We don't need to try to give them drugs. We don't need to try to pathologize them. That's just them. With athletes, there's often this notion that if you don't have your period, it's because you're too lean. Again, it's a myth. Energy balance is one component of amenorrhea, but it's not everything. Amenorrhea is multifactorial. So, I mean, are you on a drug that's going to inhibit menstruation? Because that might be the reason why you don't have a period. Sounds pretty simple, but there's a lot of people out there that go on a certain compound and then say like, oh my God, I don't have my period. And I'm like, what did you expect? That's what that drug does. Yes, you might also gain some size, but that's what that drug does. There's also, I mean, around just like stress, like why would from a very evolutionary perspective, why would your body be in a state to make babies when you're not eating or sleeping, your stress levels are ridiculously high, you're not in a physiological state to be able to actually handle that. So yeah, when you go into contest prep and you're in a hypocaloric state, you're training hours and hours and hours a day on top of everything else that's going on in your life, you might not have a period. That doesn't say that you should expect not to have it, but I mean, that's part and parcel. It's called functional amenorrhea or functional hypothalamic amenorrhea. And essentially it's stress induced, but it's not just what traditionally is thought of as being like a nutrient balance, it's stress. Like, your body is just too fucking stressed to be okay with being fertile. That's something that for some individuals lingers after they're done competing or after they've done a show. And that also too is like, I think right now I actually get a lot of women that email me and message me going like, you know what, I competed 3 months ago, I still haven't got my period back, but everything else is okay. I'm sleeping, I'm doing X, Y, and Z. And I go like, well, yeah, it's not just like a light switch gets turned on and all of a sudden you're back to where you were. It takes time. Just like postpartum, there's not a set time that you're going to expect to get your period back after you've had kids. Or when you go off birth control, it's not like there's a set time that's good or bad or normal that you're going to get your period back. At the end of the day, there's other things that are happening that we also have to look out for. So this is another big myth that I see, is that people perceive that having flow, having the bleed is the only part of, you know, your cycle, and that's just not the case. So aovulatory androgen excess, aka what people call PCOS or polycystic ovarian syndrome. So when your androgen levels in some individuals get really, really high, you might not have menses, but you might have everything else. And how you're able to kind of distinguish or track this is literally get a date book and just write down certain things that you are feeling in terms of like your digestion, your moods, your energy, but also your basal temperature. So that's just taking your temperature first thing in the morning. If you do that over the course of say 3 months, you might, and more often than not, I've seen this, people start to be able to see a trajectory happen in that they have, you know, good energy, good strength in the gym, everything's going great, and then all of a sudden their body temperature starts to go up, they stop being able to, you know, have regular bowel movements every day, their training turns to shit, and then all of a sudden, magically it goes away. And that happens 3 months around the same period of time. So they're essentially still ovulating, they're just not having menstruation, they're not having the flow. Through utilizing our own kind of methods around our bodies and what we know when we were, say, having a period, being able to compare that to like where we are when we don't have one, you can learn a lot about the body, because blood work isn't the only thing. And that's another myth, is that women who have in post-comp, I want to get my blood work done, I want to see how my hormones are. And I go, okay, but are you having a period? Are you sleeping at night? How's your energy? How's your mood? So on and so forth. What's that going to tell you that information is not going to? Sure, it's great data. But a lot of times, because when you, like I said, men and women, we have fluctuations in our hormones. So when you go and you try to get blood work done, who are they comparing it to? Is that your normal for, say, estrogen? Or is that you being compared to a norm? And you might be somebody that's got low estrogen. So there's a lot of discrepancy with blood work. I actually really find with blood work, if people really want to go into that realm, you've got to kind of do it a couple months in a row. Take a look at all your other factors as well, where your nutrition is, where your training is, where your sleep is, so on and so forth. And then be able to create like your own baseline that then you have, because especially with the athletic population, we just don't have those norms yet. We don't have, and there really isn't norms. Typically speaking, female athletes have a higher androgen level, which then is going to also affect like their estrogen levels, E1, E2, as well as their progesterone, as well as their cortisol, as well as their thyroid, and really all their endocrine hormones. So as a female athlete, when you go into the doctor and you ask for that blood test and you get it, what is that actually saying to you? Especially if your doctor says like, hey, look, everything looks great. I know you haven't had a period in like 9 months, but everything looks great. Not that they would say that, they'd probably put you on birth control, which is probably the last thing you want to do, but it's really contextual, it's really individual. Another big myth is that when you go on certain drugs, your period should stop. Again, individual. When you take certain drugs, you shouldn't get a period. Also individual. So that's where the whole anti-estrogen kind of myth, I think one of the big ones around that is that people perceive that when they compete and when they use these certain drugs like tamoxifen, so an anti-estrogen, that there's no way they should have their period. Tamoxifen is actually used as a fertility drug. So if you're taking tamoxifen and you're on a fairly high dose, even if you don't have a period, don't have flow, it doesn't mean that you still can't get pregnant. One of the first actual, like if I'm working with a practitioner, one of the first things I actually ask them is, hey, did you make sure that your patient isn't pregnant? Because just because she hasn't had a period doesn't mean that she's not healthy. She's probably really, really fertile, being that she's been on like tamoxifen for as long as she has been. So you got to check that first. You've got to check HCG first. I mean, if she's taking androgens as well, there's no way that if she pees on like a dipstick, it's going to be an accurate reading of whether or not she's pregnant. Yes, you can get pregnant when prepping for a show. Again, maybe that's another myth as well. Where else can we go with this one? There's a whole lot that we don't know and we don't talk about. I mean, hell, like if you've got high levels of inflammation in your body through stress caused from competing, eating a certain way, you might have heavier cycles. When estrogen and progesterone become imbalanced, it's going to change the way that your cycle is. So you might have breakthrough bleed. You might have a really heavy flow. If you have a really heavy flow, that means usually that your inflammation's higher. So you're probably going to have really bad constipation before, and then you're going to have diarrhea the day of and leading out of your period as well. That's through prostaglandins, which are essentially like, think of it as like lubricant. They're inflammatory markers. So I know for some people watching this is probably really uncomfortable and like TMI, but it's essential that we start talking about it, because all too often the male coaches that I have worked with, which there's actually quite a few of them now, they're like ostriches and they just put their head in the fucking sand and they kick everything up. And instead of actually asking women about their menstrual cycle, they just pretend like it doesn't exist.